Now, an important thing about musical frequencies is exemplified with the Railsback curve. So because real piano strings are stiff, the stiffness makes that there are overtones that are stretched out or inharmonic. As a result, tuners stretch the octaves, so in the lower end they are flatter, so lower, and in the higher end the octaves are sharper or a higher pitch. The reason for this is that so that the overtones can line up and there's less interference when playing across the keyboard.
I want to go through the history of musical frequencies chosen.
So it turns out that in early Renaissance and Baroque periods, there was a tendency to tune the whole orchestra of instruments to 466 Hertz. For instance, Bach. Bach is a very famous composer. He's a fundamental composer. And his organ and singers were tuning to 465 Hertz, which is called quarton. And the reason for this is because organs and pipe systems were built once in churches and they would stay fixed. And the pipe length, the metal composition, and the local air temperature would determine how A would sound. And so certain frequencies were more convenient because of it had, the organ had already been built. And so the thing is that before we had a standardization here in the mid-20th century, standardized to 440 Hertz, tuning was determined to the local geography, local region, local church even, local cities sometimes. And what even happened is that, yes, the choir and the organ would be at quarton tuning, which is 465, but sometimes woodwinds instruments, like the flutes, etc., would be at corneton or camerton tuning, which is actually 415, you can read that. Or even what's called TF camerton, even lower, 392. And depending on the piece, they might play in these different tunings. So the composer would account for this and write the musical sheet for each instrument accordingly. So let's go through a few examples to kind of hammer down the locality of the tuning. As mentioned, the weather would influence the tuning, so the temperature. So here we have the influence of different places and the different tunings that they had. And this was largely related to tuning forks that were invented at the time, and that actually differed in frequency, in fundamental frequency. So I have this because temperature is important and different local areas for the organs. So for instance, Dresden Opera was at 415 and then increased to 435. French organs in Paris, for instance, over time had increases of frequencies, and the Freiburg Cathedral also had variability before modern standardization. So this shows a highly local aspect of tuning, of which frequency is fundamental. And the things that contributed to this were the material limits. So strings instruments actually had their strings made out of gut before, so made of lamb or sheep intestines, and therefore the material had greater risk of breaking if it was too tense. So that was one of the reasons to tune at a lower hertz. But of course, woodwinds and organs could be tuned much higher, and were actually encouraged over time. This is what's called the pitch inflation, where actually there was an increase of the pitch because churches and musicians wanted to sound brighter. That's like a sun. And so there's a phenomenon that even Charlie Puth talks about. Higher frequencies means brighter sounding sound.
Why does Everybody Wants to Rule the World make you feel inspired and emotional? It's because the song is pitched up with a tape machine. Back in the day, they call this sweetening the audio.
It went so high that eventually singers were being too strained, that they had too much difficulty singing, that they protested. They said, stop to the inflation. In my other video, I show the example of Italian opera singers. But standardization was thus an important step towards allowing instruments to play together calmly. The invention of the tuning fork was actually very important in the standardization. And even French authorities recommended 435 Hz because of a tuning fork. So the tuning fork was invented by John Shaw. He did better than what I did.
in the 18th century.
And subsequent improvements allowed for more reproducible pitches. These are the hertz. Later, a German physicist created in 1834 a machine called the tonometer, which is a set of tuning forks, and recommended A at 440 hertz. As mentioned, French authorities recommended A at 435 hertz, and this was then adopted in a conference in Vienna in 1885, which affected Austria, Italy, Hungary, Russia, Prussia, Saxony, Sweden, and Württemberg. This conference was mentioned in the treaties of Versailles that ended World War I. That's how important the concert pitch standardization was. Now, the standardization to 440 hertz was first done in 1917 by American musicians, which is the American Federation of Musicians, calling it the American Standard Pitch. The US, there was already an early adoption of 440 hertz by instrument makers. In London, in 1939, there was a conference where several European countries like France, Germany, Italy, England, and the Netherlands met and recommended A at 440 hertz. Since then, several orchestras and instruments have been using 440 hertz, but there's still some variations where some orchestras tune slightly higher or slightly lower for different reasons. Maybe because of the local tradition, because of the acoustics of the halls, or maybe the instrument ensembles, maybe trying to replicate the Baroque or Renaissance period tuning of this. Thank you for studying with me and watching this film. Make sure to let me know in the comments what is the next topic you'd like me to dive deep into. Is there another aspect of music and its therapeutic applications, sound therapy, rhythms that heal, another aspect that heals that you've thought on that I spoke about in this video? Let me know and let's study together. Make sure to subscribe, comment, and like. These are good books.